It was supposed to be just another smooth flight back home. Rachel, 10 years old, traveling with her father, smiled as she watched the clouds through the window. She had no idea, and perhaps couldn't have imagined, that the flight would end in a medical emergency. A sharp abdominal pain, vomiting, cold sweat. By the time they landed, the child was already unconscious. The ambulance arrived before the luggage. Rushed to the hospital, tests revealed a severe inflammation of the appendix on the verge of bursting. It was a case for immediate surgery. Her mother, across the country, boarded a flight immediately. But someone else, thousands of miles away, was already in action. No plane, no suitcase, no agenda. Just a grandmother on her knees, in prayer. And that's where this story truly begins. Not in the hospital, but in the place where the heavens start to move before medicine can act. Because what you're about to hear is not just about a miracle. It's about a bond that not even distance can break. A prayer that crosses continents, surgical rooms, and medical diagnoses. It's about the exact moment a grandmother, alone, in her living room felt an unexplained chill and immediately fell to her knees. And while doctors rushed, while machines beeped, while human hands tried to save, another hand, invisible but real, began to move. This is the story of how God answers a prayer whispered in silence but filled with love. And how sometimes He doesn't wait for the request to finish before He starts helping. But what sustains such faith? What is the promise that keeps someone interceding even when everything seems unanswered? Hidden in the scriptures, there is a psalm few people know, but perhaps one of the most powerful declarations of intercession. A psalm that doesn't just ask, but sends. And today, it might become the anchor of your soul as well. Stay with me until the end, because this promise has a name, and it's about to be revealed. Write in the comments the name of someone you've been praying for. Or if it's your own name crying for help, write that too. Share your story, your request, or just your heart. Let's build together a living chain of intercession, where every name is like a breath sent to heaven, every word a candle lit in the dark, and every prayer the beginning of a miracle. And if this message touches your heart, like this video and subscribe. Not for me, but for everyone still waiting, in silence, for an answer that comes from above. Because sometimes when everything seems to be falling apart, it is in the silence of a distant prayer that heaven begins to rebuild. And when a grandmother prays, God moves heaven all the way to the hospital. In the cold hospital hallways, the clock struck 3:17 a.m. Rachel's father paced back and forth waiting for news from surgery. The doctors had been clear. The situation was critical. The infection had already spread, and every second counted. Across the country, in a small village in North Carolina, a gray-haired woman felt something strange. She hadn't received any call, no message. But she felt with an inexplicable force that something was wrong. Her name was Martha, Rachel's grandmother, a believer since she was 20, a woman of quiet faith who prayed every night with a notebook in hand, where she wrote down the names of those she loved. That night, she felt something she couldn't explain. It was as if a pain had pierced her chest without warning. She set the kettle aside, turned off the TV, and knelt on the living room rug. She didn't know, but at that exact moment, doctors were facing a complication in the operating room. Rachel had suffered a sudden drop in blood pressure, and as the machines beeped, a nurse noticed something. The girl was whispering disconnected words. Among them, a name, Grandma. Grandma. Coincidence? Martha didn't think so. As she bent her knees, she didn't ask for explanations. She just prayed. And her prayer wasn't made of beautiful words, but deep groans. She cried out with authority, like someone who knew exactly who she was talking to. Lord, reach my granddaughter now. Wherever she is, send your angel. Place your hand, hold her life in Jesus' name. At the hospital, after long moments of tension, Rachel's blood pressure stabilized. The doctors regained control of the situation. And when the lead surgeon breathed a sigh of relief, no one there knew that, across the country, a grandmother was wiping away tears and whispering, Thank you, Lord. I know you heard me. In that moment, something invisible had moved, and even if science couldn't explain it, faith already knew. In the waiting room, Rachel's father finally got the news the surgery had been a success. There would be difficult days ahead, of course, but she was out of immediate danger. He breathed a sigh of relief. But on the other end of the line, when he called his mother to tell her, he heard something that left him speechless. I already knew, son. I was praying. And this is where the story takes its first turn, because more than a clinical miracle, what happened that night was the reunion of two forces the world tries to separate: love and faith. A grandmother who prays without knowing the danger. A granddaughter who, even unconscious, calls her name. A moment when heaven bends to touch the earth, not because someone deserved it, but because someone interceded. And if you're wondering whether this was just luck or a mere coincidence, I invite you to keep watching, because what comes next will show that heaven doesn't move at random. It responds to a call, and that call has a name and an address, and it might just be yours. In the days that followed, Rachel remained in the ICU under intense observation, sedated, unconscious, surrounded by machines and monitors. Her body was still fighting. But somehow, the worst had already passed, and while doctors treated her from the outside, something mysterious was happening within. It was as if her soul, even in silence, was trying to rise again. Meanwhile, Martha, her grandmother, never stopped praying. She didn't even know the full extent of what had happened. She was only informed days later. But the conviction in her heart was as clear as daylight. God woke me up that night for a reason, and if he made me feel it, it's because he was present. Martha spent the following days in her room, alternating between moments of worship and deep intercession. In her notebook, Rachel's name was now circled. Beside it, she wrote, "This is not the end." And as a woman who carries more on her knees than in her hands, she kept crying out, without seeing, without understanding, but believing. What's interesting is that during this time, the medical team began to notice something unusual in Rachel. Even without responding, her vital signs were surprisingly stable. It was as if her body was reorganizing itself from within, as if some invisible force was holding together what in medical theory should have been collapsing. One of the nurses, Sarah, said to the head doctor, "It's strange. We've seen so many similar cases that don't react this way. There's something different about her." And he replied, almost chuckling, "If it's a miracle, let it continue. We need some good news." But what no one knew, except for a grandmother on her knees in another state, was that the good news had already been written long before the medical report was updated. God had already begun his work. Days later, Rachel opened her eyes. She didn't say a word, she just cried. And in that first moment of awareness, a nurse gently asked, "Are you in pain?" She shook her head, pointed to her chest and whispered, "I felt a presence." And even though no one in that room could explain it, she knew. It was as if, during her time between life and death, something had touched her soul. Something that scalpels can't reach. Something no medical report can describe. And while Rachel began her slow recovery, miles away, Martha felt a weight lift from her heart. It was as if heaven had breathed peace, as if God had whispered, "She's back." And in that moment, she did something she had never done before. She opened her Bible and asked God for a verse. Not a random one, a specific one. Something that would be the exact answer to all she had lived. And the page fell on a psalm rarely mentioned. A psalm even forgotten by many preachers. But right then, in that exact moment, it shone like a burning arrow in the dark. Martha read, her eyes filled with tears. "Now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand." It was Psalm 20, and every word was a living confirmation of everything she had prayed. But there was still something to be done. Because when God answers with a psalm, it's not to keep it hidden. It's to be shared, spread, like a living promise capable of reaching other hearts, other hospital beds, other silent prayers. Rachel spent the following days being slowly disconnected from the machines. With each exam, the doctors confirmed she was responding beyond expectations. Her brain had not suffered major damage, her heart was strong, and her kidneys were functioning again. But the most impressive thing wasn't what the machines revealed. It was what the medical team saw when they walked into her room. Rachel was smiling. Even still weak, even with visible signs of her battle, there was a new light in her eyes. Something you can't prescribe, something that doesn't come from treatment, but from faith. When Martha finally got the family's permission to visit her granddaughter in the hospital, she crossed the country by bus. Not because it was the only option, but because she wanted to use the travel time to pray. As she passed each city, she closed her eyes and repeated Psalm 20, "Lord, let this promise be fulfilled." She carried with her an envelope. Inside were 20 printed copies of the psalm, each with a handwritten note. For someone who needs to know that heaven still answers. When she arrived at the hospital, the scene was quietly moving. Rachel, still recovering, opened her eyes and saw her grandmother entering, slowly but with purpose. No dramatic words were exchanged, just a long look filled with meaning. Then, a prolonged hug, the kind that seals something sacred. And it was there, in that room, that Martha gave her granddaughter the first copy of the psalm. "This was the verse God gave me the night you almost left us. I didn't know what was happening, but He already knew. And now, I want you to read it out loud." Rachel, with a trembling voice, read, "Now I know that the Lord saves His anointed." And when she finished, tears flowed silently. The promise had arrived, and it hadn't just saved, it had marked. The copies of the psalm began circulating throughout the hospital. Nurses discreetly hung them on walls. Patients asked to keep one tucked inside their Bibles. Even more skeptical doctors received them with respect. It was as if that simple text carried something everyone there needed, a reminder that there's a greater force, one that acts even when it can't be seen. But the most beautiful part was still to come. An elderly woman, hospitalized on the same floor as Rachel, was facing a terminal diagnosis. She was alone. No visitors, no hope. One of the nurses, while chatting with her, felt prompted to hand her a copy of the psalm. At first, the woman showed no reaction. She just read it silently. The next day, she asked for another. And after that, she asked for prayer. She said she didn't want to leave this world in fear, that she wanted to trust in that God who still answers from heaven. And right there, in a soft voice, the prayer was spoken. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The nurse wrote in the chart, "Patient calm, fell asleep smiling." No one knew, but a silent miracle had just happened there. And what if the true purpose of pain is to carve paths for others to find comfort? What if what wounds us becomes the bridge God uses to reach broken hearts we may never even meet? The psalm that came to Martha that night wasn't just a reply, it was a mission. And now that mission was multiplying, spreading, turning into a flame. On the week Rachel was officially discharged, the medical team gathered in the hospital corridor to say goodbye. It wasn't common for patients to leave with such emotional involvement, but something in her journey had touched everyone. Every step, from the quiet admission to the triumphant return home, left deep marks. Not just in medical charts, but in the hearts of those who had walked beside her. A nurse commented, "Some people heal with medicine. She healed with presence." And Martha, standing beside her granddaughter, simply smiled. She didn't need to say a word. Heaven had already spoken for her. Back home, Rachel asked for her Bible to be placed on her nightstand. Not because she wanted to dive into deep study, but because now, that word had become alive. Psalm 20 was no longer just a quote, it was a testimony, and it didn't take long for her to start writing about it. On a simple blog, she began sharing her story, not seeking fame, but hoping to plant seeds of faith. Her first post went viral. People from across the country began commenting, "I also have a Martha in my life. Or my grandmother used to send me psalms when I was in the hospital. Now I know it wasn't random. Among the hundreds of messages Rachel received, one stood out. It came from a woman named Claire, from a small town in California. She said her 4-year-old son was about to undergo a high-risk surgery, and the night before, she stumbled upon Rachel's blog. Reading about Psalm 20 sparked something inside her. She printed the passage and placed it under her son's pillow. The next day, during the procedure, doctors discovered the condition was less severe than the scans had shown. The surgery was canceled. Claire wrote, "I can't explain it, but I felt like someone prayed for us, like heaven leaned into that room." Rachel cried as she read the message, and she understood. Intercession knows no bounds. When someone truly prays, heaven crosses miles, pierces hospital walls, and reaches even those who never asked. With time, the story became a talk. Invited by a church, Rachel shared her testimony in front of dozens of people. But before stepping onto the stage, she added something new to her message. She asked everyone to take a piece of paper and write the name of someone fighting a battle, whether in body or soul. At the end, the papers were placed into a prayer box, and before praying, she read Psalm 20 aloud. The atmosphere shifted. People began to cry. Others embraced. Someone whispered, "This is exactly what I needed today." And in that moment, Rachel realized what began as the quiet intercession of a grandmother was now a movement. What if your testimony could open doors pain tried to close? What if the healing isn't just yours, but also for everyone who hears your story? Because when a miracle is shared, it stops being just an experience and becomes living hope. On the morning of her birthday, Rachel woke up with a different feeling. The sun peeked softly through the window, but her heart was full. Not with excitement, but with something more rare: deep peace. It was her first birthday at home after the long hospitalization. No machines, no gowns, no scent of antiseptic. Just the sound of a kettle on the stove, her grandmother's voice humming softly in the kitchen, and an old notebook waiting to be filled. She smiled, picked up her pen, and wrote at the top of the page, "Today marks 1 year since heaven invaded the hospital." And from that moment on, she never stopped writing. She began organizing her notes, her prayers, the handwritten messages exchanged with Martha, and the names left in the comments of her videos. Everything in order, everything with intention. And that's how the project Prayer in Motion was born, an initiative that united intercession, testimonies, and small weekly gatherings in local hospitals. Volunteers would read psalms to patients, leave anonymous letters at bedsides, and collect prayer requests in boxes scattered across the wards. And at every meeting, without exception, Psalm 20 was read aloud. Because the psalm that had once been an anchor for Rachel had now become a bridge to hundreds of hearts. Rachel had no idea who would receive that envelope. She just knew she had to send it. It was a Wednesday morning when she woke up with what she described as a holy impulse. She took a printed copy of Psalm 20, the one already engraved in her heart, and wrote by hand, right below it, "You are not alone." This promise once sustained someone who no longer knew how to pray. Maybe now, it's your turn. With no specific address, she placed it in a white envelope, added a stamp, and simply wrote, "Prayer or Care Department, Regional Hospital." And then she prayed, "Lord, take this letter wherever it's needed most. Let it not be me who chooses, let it be your Spirit." In that simple gesture, Rachel wasn't just sending paper. She was releasing faith into the invisible. The envelope made its way. It passed through sorting, through unknown hands, until it landed on a desk in the pediatric department of a rural hospital. No one there knew exactly who the letter was meant for, but something about it caught attention. It was discreet, yet carried a different kind of energy. The head nurse, intrigued, opened it, and as she read the handwritten message, a chill ran down her spine. She held the envelope in her hands for several minutes. She felt she couldn't just file it away. Something inside urged, "Deliver it." But to whom? She looked around. Everyone was busy. That's when she saw a woman sitting alone, leaning against the wall in the hallway, hugging her knees, eyes fixed on the floor. It was Laura, the mother of little Benjamin, only 4 years old, who had been hospitalized. With a worsening brain infection, the medical team avoided making predictions. The tests were discouraging. Sedation had been constant. Laura hadn't slept in 36 hours. She no longer cried. She just existed in that cold hallway. When the nurse approached and handed her the envelope, Laura responded almost automatically. She took it, nodded in thanks, but didn't open it right away. She just held it, as if it were the last thread of hope. Hours later, once the hospital had grown quiet, she opened the letter. She read slowly, and when she reached the part of the psalm, her throat tightened. "Now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving power of his right hand." It felt as if someone had been waiting for that very moment to say, "I heard you." Laura couldn't hold back. She wept, quietly, not to disturb others. It was the kind of crying that comes from deep within, as if all the fear and despair she had held in began pouring out through her eyes. She didn't know who Rachel was. She didn't know why that envelope had found her. But she knew, deep in her soul, that it wasn't by chance. It was an answer, a silent proof that heaven still moves, even when earth feels frozen. Holding the letter close to her chest, she prayed. For the first time in days, she prayed in complete sentences. She asked God to sustain her son, to strengthen what was left inside her. And that night, for the first time since Benjamin fell asleep, Laura was able to sleep too. Not because the pain was gone, but because finally, she felt carried from within. The next morning, Laura woke up early. Benjamin remained sedated, but his vitals were stable. The test results hadn't worsened. Small improvements. Just a few lines in a medical chart, but for her, they meant a miracle. Still holding the envelope, she felt the need to respond. She asked for paper and a pen and wrote back to whoever had sent it. The letter was simple, but full of soul. It read, "I don't know who you are, but your envelope found me at the exact moment I needed it. I was about to give up my vigil. I thought I had become invisible and even to God. But your prayer arrived, and it was as if heaven said, 'I heard what no one else did. Thank you. I don't have any other word. Just this, thank you.'" The hospital coordinator tracked down the sender and mailed the letter back to Rachel, who read it through tears. She now held the proof that when a prayer is offered in truth, distance doesn't matter. It will always reach its destination. Rachel sat in silence for several minutes, holding that letter like it was a piece of heaven on paper. She didn't know Laura. She had never heard of Benjamin. But she knew, with a certainty that needed no explanation, that this response was testimony that faith knows no borders. The note, the prayer, the envelope, none of it was grand in the world's eyes, but to God it was immense, because it was done with soul. And when the soul prays, even without seeing, heaven answers, even in silence. Rachel stored the letter in a box filled with other testimonies. But before closing it, she wrote a phrase on the back of the envelope. It was as if God said, "I heard what no one else did." That sentence echoed in her mind for days, because now she knew that even the quietest gestures, when done with faith, have the power to cross continents, enter hospitals, and touch hearts. And it was at that moment Rachel understood. She would never know how many lives would be touched by that psalm. She might never hear the other testimonies, but that didn't matter, because the role of faith is not to count results, it is to plant seeds. Some bloom before our eyes, others we only discover in heaven, but all of them, every single one, carries the signature of God. Rachel kept that letter with reverence, like someone who knows they've been touched by something greater, and that very same weekend, something even more surprising would happen. Through the hands of a child who could barely read, yet already understood what faith was. One day, during one of those gatherings, an 8-year-old girl named Emily asked to read the psalm instead of an adult. Everyone looked at each other in surprise, but no one said no. With the sheet trembling in her small hands, Emily began, "May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob protect you. Her voice was firm, yet gentle. When she finished, she looked at Rachel and said, "When I grow up, I want to be like you. Someone who prays from far away and changes things nearby." That sentence echoed in Rachel's mind for days. Because without knowing it, Emily had summed up exactly what intercession is. A touch that happens without hands, a presence that travels across distance, a prayer that finds paths where feet cannot go. And now, if you've made it this far, maybe God is calling you to be part of this too. Maybe your role isn't to be Rachel or Martha. Maybe you're someone who carries a name in your heart. And if that's the case, write it here in the comments. Say the name of someone you love, someone who needs a breath of miracle, someone who is fighting silently. Let's turn this space into a living chain of intercession, where each comment becomes a prayer, each name a petition to heaven, and each story a reminder that Jesus still moves heaven when someone bends their knees. And remember, hospitals may have protocols, but heaven has promises. And when you pray for someone, even from a distance, God hears you as if you were right there, beside them, touching, caring, loving. Because the real miracle of intercession is this: not being seen, and yet changing everything.